That's a good example of an accommodation that eventually turned into a modification.
Right.
While it was an accommodation was being made while you all were physically carrying those children through the doors.
Yeah.
But eventually that led to a modification of the property by widening the doors.
So there's nothing in like building codes or anything like that whenever they're building like large, like commercial property.
There is now. So anything constructed now, you don't have a choice about how you comply. You have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act during your construction process. But for older facilities, you have the choice of making either a modification or an accommodation.
Okay. And there's no like person that goes around to see if they are or not. It just depends on if someone just makes a complaint.
It's a complaint-based process, yeah. It's all about who files the complaints. That's exactly right.
Well, I know for us, we have to be, for us, we have to be ADA compliant because, we run a assisted living. And so yearly at all assisted livings, no matter the size, someone has to come and actually do an inspection. But for you, they probably do it biannually or something like that. Someone does walk around, but it's based on the year it was made. Since ours was made built in 2019, we have to follow special rules. But anything prior to 1977, they can have their doorways as narrow and as wide as they want, because I guess it was based on their grandfather.
As long as they're willing to make an accommodation, by carrying somebody or doing those things. Yeah. So, whether you're actually required to change the physical structure or not is based on when the structure was constructed. And we had to deal with ADA requirements as a real estate school. Our in-person real estate classes were, regulated by the ADA. Are the doorways wide enough? Are the restrooms accessible? Are you on the first floor? Or if you're not on the first floor, does the building have an elevator? Those are all questions that we had to answer. So it's a major requirement, and the dealing with service animals, and so if you're going to go into property management, make sure you really get up to speed on what is considered a service animal in each setting, because it's different in a commercial setting than a residential setting, which we're going to talk about here as well. We want to talk about fair housing and how that
Hey, they're thinking like a realtor.
I have no idea why those are in there. It's so hilarious that those are in there. Okay, let's talk about fair housing laws that you might be tested on. And there are, Justine said she's seen so many fair housing violations, it's scary, and it is. It is terrifying to me that we still cannot get this right all these years later. And so fair housing, and housing is the key word for test taking purposes and real life application purposes. You need to understand that these laws only apply to what type of real estate. These are not
residential.
Only residential. Fair housing laws only apply to residential settings. So that the first law that came into effect in the United States, which dealt with fair housing as a topic, was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the first law that prevented discrimination on any basis. You could have discriminated for any reason legally prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And yes, you will need to know that year, and you will need to know that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 only focuses on race as a protected class. The Fair Housing Act, which came almost 100 years, actually more than 100 years later, focuses on many different groups of people. But the Civil Rights Act of 1866 says that you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in the United States for any reason. Now that would include commercial real estate. This is the only law in the chapter that crosses the divide between residential and commercial. This one covers both because it says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race for any reason. Here's one thing you should pay attention to for test taking purposes. This statement right here. As we get it deeper into the fair housing laws, we're going to talk about, just like every other rule we talk about in the class in law, the exceptions to the rule. What are the exceptions to the Fair Housing Act? When can someone legally discriminate against another person? Because there are exceptions to the Fair Housing Act. But there are no exceptions to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So if you were asked on a test, when is it legally appropriate for someone to discriminate on the basis of race in a real estate transaction, what would your answer be?
Never.
Never.
Never, because the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Now, don't apply that to anything other than race. This is where, and I have to caution you in this chapter, you have to read these laws for only what they are. These are not laws that say don't discriminate. These are laws that say don't discriminate on this basis. Don't discriminate for this reason. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 doesn't prevent discrimination. It prevents discrimination on the basis of what?
Race.
Race. So if somebody said, I will not sell a house to people who are Jewish, would that be a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866?
Yeah.
No.
No.
No, that's a religion, not a race.
Only prevents discrimination on the basis of race. Jewish is not a race, that's a religion. Islamic is a religion. There's a reason, by the way, I use those as examples because they've been used in tests before and people think they're races for whatever reason. They're not. Those are
Hey
religious.
Travis, I just gotta stop you real quick because we have a couple questions popping up, starting with Justine. And that's when co-ops become a thing. I think that was the very first thing you were talking about.
Right. Let's see. And that's when co-ops became a thing. Yes, eventually, as the fair housing laws went into effect, that's when co-ops became much more popular. We're going to talk about redlining, so hold on to that thought. Redlining is a lending practice that involves discrimination. And Anna said, so if this came to be in 1866, how were subdivisions still writing into their HOA rules in the 1950s that certain races couldn't buy property there? That gets to the whole idea of the segregation era of the United States and our history, where this whole idea of separate but equal, a lot of that idea and thought came out of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, because for a long period of time, there was this misguided way of thinking that you could say that someone couldn't build or buy in this neighborhood as long as there was another neighborhood they could build or buy in. Such a stupid, crazy, misguided way of thinking, but it was the prevailing way of thinking for the country for 100 years. But it's a good question, Anna, and that's how. And that was the whole basis eventually of the Supreme Court decisions that said separate but equal was a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. You could not do that. But it took a long time to get there. Are we all good on this law and its impact? So any discrimination based on race in any way would currently be a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This law is still on the books and it's still very much in force. Okay. The Federal Fair Housing Act did not come along until 1968, so a little over 100 years later, the Federal Fair Housing Act. Now, the Federal Fair Housing Act was not nearly as wide-reaching as the Civil Rights Act, because the Civil Rights Act was aimed at everything. It said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in residential property, you can't discriminate in commercial property, you can't discriminate in hiring, you can't discriminate in firing. Now, whether it worked or not, different discussion. But that's what the law said in 1866. In 1968, we passed the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was specifically targeted at the prevention of discrimination in the housing sector. So whether we were selling housing or renting housing, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were targeted specifically at housing and saying you cannot discriminate on the basis of certain things. And there were originally 4 of them. There are now 7 of those things. Here's what I'm going to say it again. The Fair Housing Act does not, even to this day, say that discrimination is illegal in real estate transactions. I know you don't like this. I don't like this. I don't like saying it. I don't like putting that negative energy out there in the universe, but I have to say it because otherwise you're going to miss test questions. Are there, even today, still very legal forms of discrimination in housing? Are there people who legally are allowed to discriminate in housing today?
Yes.
And the answer to that is yes, there are. Because there is no law that says you can't discriminate in housing. There is a law that says you cannot discriminate on the basis of these 7 things. And we're going to talk about what those 7 are. Let me tell you why that's important. Because on the test, they're going to throw a lot of stuff at you that's not actually part of the law. But it sounds good and it makes you feel good, so you go with it. Travis refuses to sell a home to a couple because they are in their 70s. Has he violated the Federal Fair Housing Act? What do you think the answer to that question is?
No.
Yes.
No.
If the age discrimination is
Age-
part of the
Age
7,
is on there. There's no age.
He has not. And the reason is age is not one of these 7 protected classes. And that's where you have to be super careful on this test. There are 7 groups of people that are protected from discrimination. And those are the only ones that on a test you can say are protected. Now, in your real practice of the business, my advice would clearly be don't discriminate against anybody for any reason at any time. I mean, to me, that's the best business decision. It's the ethically right thing to do. It's the morally right thing to do. Why would you? But that's my personal opinion. I have to teach you federal law. Federal law says you're not protected unless you're on this list. There are no protections unless you're on this list. It says, what does it mean to be protected? Protected status means that these topics, these 7 things, cannot even be discussed in what kind of a transaction?
Residential transaction.
In a residential transaction, so that's either a rental or a sale. When it comes to helping someone decide on what to show, sell, or lease somebody, not only can they not be discussed, they can't be part of your decision making and how you render your services. You cannot decide what listings to send somebody based on what you think the racial makeup of the neighborhood is, or what you think the nationality is of people who live there. You cannot send certain listings to certain buyers because they have children, but send different listings to other buyers because they don't have children, because all of those things show up on this list of off-limits topics. So when something shows up on this list, we can never engage in any sort of a discussion with our clients about these things and ultimately what they choose as far as their choice of housing, whether they choosing to buy or rent or who to lease to. None of these things can be part of that discussion as far as we are concerned as real estate brokers. Now, we can't prevent buyers and sellers and landlords and tenants from engaging in discrimination. We just have to tell them that we certainly cannot be a participant in that, and we will never help them discriminate. And if we find out they're discriminating, we will stop working with them. So here's a little trick you can use to help you remember the 7 protected classes. Is fresh corn. If you just think of spelling out the words fresh corn, and then you just drop the vowels out, drop out the E and drop out the O, you're left with 7 letters, and that will help you remember the 7 things that are protected as groups that can't be discriminated against under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And we're going to talk about what each one of these means. I'm going to skip familial status for a second because I want to come back to it. Are we all okay on what race means? Is everybody okay on what race means as a protected group?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So we'll go with race. Are we all okay with sex as far as what it means? It means gender, by the way. Get your mind out of the gutter. It's not a yes or no question. It's not a, it's not a preference. No, this is now, all joking aside, sex in this context only means gender. This does not say sexual orientation. This does not say gender identity. Those things are not on this list. Those are things they will try to trip you up with on the test. This is specifically gender. So you cannot say to a buyer, well, I'm not sure you'd be comfortable here because, I notice I notice you're female and it might be a rough neighborhood for you. No. By the same token, what if you have a client who says to you, I'm looking for a place to rent, but I only would feel comfortable renting from other people who also speak Chinese. See, that doesn't sound like discrimination. That sounds like they want it because it would make them comfortable. Is it still discrimination?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
It is, because on this list right here, national origin is one of those things that we can't talk about. So we cannot discriminate on the basis of race. We cannot discriminate on the basis of sex or gender. We cannot discriminate on the basis of someone's handicap. In other words, so let me give you an example of what discrimination on the basis of someone's handicap would look like. What if you have a buyer who comes to you and they are wheelchair bound, and you choose not to send them certain listings because there are too many stairs in the property? Would that be an example of discriminating against them based on their handicap?
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, if they tell you, please don't send me things with stairs, that's not discrimination. That is their preference. And they didn't say why. They just said, please don't send me things with stairs, because anybody might say that to you. But if you're looking at them and making a judgment call and thinking, I'm not going to send them listings with stairs because they're in a wheelchair, that absolutely would be considered discrimination based on their handicap status. Color and race are very similar in their treatment under the law. And religion. Religion means religious affiliation. Christian, Islamic, Judaism, non-secular, Mennonite, Mormon, whatever, the Buddhist, whatever it happens to be, for whomever it happens to be, you cannot talk about someone's religion when it comes to a residential real estate transaction. That's going to be an off-limits topic.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So the town I grew up in was very highly Jewish populated, and when they would look for homes, they wanted to be within walking distance to the temple. Is that illegal to talk about something like that?
It is. That's a really great question. So the question was, what if a Jewish family tells me that they would like to be within walking distance to a temple. Can I assist them with that? And the answer is no, I cannot, because that gets too close to making us assisting them with making the decision based on religion. Now,
Right.
just to show you how fine that line can be, Sheila, if they were to say, I need to be within walking distance of, and give you an address or an intersection, you could absolutely assist them with that.
Okay. That
I have a question.
helps really simplify it. Thank you.
Yeah.
But how would that be any different from saying like a family saying they wanted to be within walking distance to a school or something?
Because schools are not on this list.
Um,
So if they say, I want to be within walking distance to a school, I can talk about that because school is not a protected class on this list. It's not something I have to shy away from as a topic.
Travis, I have a question.
Go for it,
So
Donnie.
you know the reference you made about how the Chinese lady like preferred to live in like someone who also spoke Chinese.
Mhm.
Okay, so like say that they like their first language was Chinese. How would you like go about telling them like, hey, I can't, you know what I mean? Because that's part of the list. So how would you go about telling them that?
You mean if I had a language barrier, or you just mean in general, how would I do
In
it?
general, if they did have language barrier, but they could speak a little bit of English, and they told you that, what would you tell them?
I
Since
would
it is
say
part
to
of the
them, you know, as much as I understand why you would ask that question, I'm not allowed to do that because there are federal laws that prevent it. And so, you know, I can show you property. You can decide if you're comfortable with the area, but that'll have to be your decision. I cannot, you know, sort of make that decision for you by deciding if there are these kind of people or not these kind of people. That will ultimately be something you will have to decide your own comfort level with without my involvement. But I can certainly show you properties that meet your criteria. That's kind of where you have to take that discussion.
Have you ever had
Can't
to
you,
deal with that in real life?
I'm sorry?
Have you ever had to deal with that in like real
Oh,
life?
yeah, all the time. All the time. I mean, you know, with families that want to be near the same ethnicity, with parents who want to be near other families with children. Because we're going to talk about that being a protected class here in just a second. That's the one we didn't mention, by the way, that familial status one. Somebody else I heard chime in. I don't know who it
no,
was.
I was going to say, Travis, that can the client state to you that they would like to live in a particular neighborhood? For example, in your neighborhood has a name, but your
Yeah.
neighborhood might be known for the area of where Chinese, you know, individuals
Right.
mostly live. So the
Yeah.
client can come to you and say, I would prefer to live in Broadwood Creek neighborhood.
Correct. And
That would be,
that is absolutely acceptable under the law because it's coming from the client side of things.
right.
You know, they are giving us specifics of a property. Unfortunately, we know that there are things that are sometimes substituted, Tasha, for these protected classes. Schools is often one of those things. You know, like, for example, I cut my teeth in real estate. My office is in Chapel Hill. I have sold thousands of houses in Chapel Hill and Durham. And trust me, I know when somebody was being discriminatory using the school system as a proxy for
Right.
race about the Durham schools. You know,
Right.
because I have heard many people say who didn't even have kids, well, is that in the Durham schools? Because we don't want to be in the Durham schools. And I'm, you know, and so I knew what that meant. That being said, that is a legal, I'm not saying you have to represent that person, by the way. I'm just saying, does that violate the law? Technically, no, because it is directly from the client. Now, if a real estate agent were to insert that, if somebody were to say to you as a real estate agent, well, you know, I don't want to be around families of this ethnicity. and you said, well, I can't help you with that, but what I can tell you is if you stay in the Durham schools versus or if you stay in the Chapel Hill schools versus the Durham schools, you're going to have a lot less chance of that. That would be discriminatory, clearly, because you're essentially teaching them how to circumvent.
How to be discriminating.
Exactly. Did that help answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, if people give you a specific neighborhood, then you don't know how they came up with that criteria or why. Then that's not a violation under the law. Absolutely.
I asked that because when my husband and I were looking for property, we had a realtor that actually coached along that way towards, an area. That's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, and I would say
discussion.
if it's the realtor or real estate professional who's coaching along, then that's much more likely to be a violation than if it's a real estate agent just responding to what they were specifically told by a client.
Right.
For example, I live near Farmington Woods Elementary School in Cary. If somebody came to me and said, I want to be in Farmington Woods Elementary because, my kids already go there, then that's what I would search for, properties within that school district. But if they came to me and said, now listen, we don't want to be around the wrong kind of people. Where do we need to be? And I said to them, well, I would stick to Farmington Woods if I was you. That's a whole, even though Farmington Woods is the same point of contact, it's a whole different discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Travis, I have a question. When we talked about the anti-discrimination clause in the agency agreements and the offer to purchase contract, does it only protect these 7 classes or does it go above that?
It protects these 7.
Just
that's all
7.
That's all the state of North Carolina requires is a non-discrimination statement about these 7.
Okay.
Yeah. Brittany said something about neighborhoods saying they are safe. And again, I try to stay away from things like that because to me, that's a very subjective terminology. What is safe to me may be completely dangerous to someone else or vice versa. So I try to stay away from that. Is that technically a violation of the law? Probably not. Maybe in the context, but I would stay away from it. As far as testing purposes for you all, one that you're definitely going to be tested on is familial status. And this is the one that if you don't pay attention right now, it will trap you because the name is confusing. Familial status does not refer to family. It does not refer to marital status. It doesn't have anything to do with how many people are in the family unit or are not in the family unit. Familial status only refers to one thing: children. Are there children being discussed? That's it. That's what's protected. So if you go back to this list, what you could really do is take that off of there and say that the protected class is really what?
Children.
Children. Now remember, I said everything on this list is off limits as a topic of discussion in a residential transaction. How often do you think people are going to want to discuss their children as part of a residential transaction?
All the time.
All the time.
Every single time. This is by far the hardest one to deal with in the real world when you're trying to do things the right way. Because people will continually say things like, well, are there other kids in this neighborhood? And they and listen, let's be honest. Is that a fair question if you have children? I mean, as a parent, is that a fair question?
Yes.
No doubt. That does not change the fact that the law says you can't have that discussion as a real estate broker, as a real estate licensee. So if you are asked, are there other children in the neighborhood? That is not a question you can answer. How many families have children in this neighborhood? That is not a question you can answer. You have to get away from that question. And what the law says you're supposed to do is inform them that you can't answer that question. Now, you have to find ways to smooth that over, because that's going to upset people they feel like you're trying to avoid helping, and that's not the case. Because when somebody says, well, is this a good neighborhood for my kids? That's not a question I can answer. So what I would respond to them is, and I always take the sort of, I'm on your side type thing. I say, believe it or not, it's not a question I can answer. But here's what I follow up with. Besides, you don't want my opinion anyway. You want to decide what's right for you. So you tell me what you're specifically looking for in a neighborhood, and I can help you find that. Do you think that's a good way to kind of diffuse that sort of a question and move past it without talking about the thing we're not supposed to talk about?
Yeah.
But what if they come back and say family area is what I'm looking for?
See, that's the thing. That's not a violation. And that's why I have to point out that the thing that's actually protected, even though the words here are familial status, the thing that's protected are children. So if they say, is this a family-oriented area? I'm not saying I'm necessarily going to answer that question. I'm saying there's nothing that prevents me from answering that question. But
Got it.
It's still subjective. And I try to stay away from subjective questions anyway. So what I would say, if they came back to me and said, well, I just mean, is it a good family area? What I would say to them is, well, you tell me what's a good family area for your family. Because see, I can talk about family. What I can't talk about is specifically children. Does that make sense for everybody? And that's why I say this is the hardest one, because it's hard to understand what they're trying to prevent. I don't know why they just didn't say children are the protected class. It would be much easier to understand.
Yeah.
But that's the protected class.
I'm thinking like on HGTV, but I think they skirt it by always saying what school district they want to be in.
That's exactly it. And we realize that. But that also is where we have to be careful. But if they give us certain criteria, and so we can talk about schools. Here's the best way somebody summed it up for me years ago, and it stuck with me. Somebody said, you can talk about schools all you want to, just don't talk about the things that go into school.
Ah, there you go.
And I took that to heart. When somebody says, what school district is this in? I can answer that question, because that's just a factual, factoid about the property. It is in the Farmington Woods School District. Now, if somebody says, is that a good school? That's a question I can answer. I'm not going to, because again, I don't know what their definition of good is. Their definition of good may be entirely different than my definition of good. But I can answer. I don't have to completely avoid that question. So what I would say is, well, you tell me what you're looking for in a school, and I can tell you if that's here. Are you looking for a certain course of study? Are you looking for a certain student population size? Would you like to set up an interview with the principal? We can do all of those things. But now, if that's a different question than somebody says, well, is this a good school for my kids? See, I have to stay away from that second thing. It's the connection to children. And I'll tell you why this one is a protected class. Let me tell you why this one is here. Do you think, especially in rentals, that certain landlords would choose not to rent to families that had children if they had the choice of a family that has children versus a family that does not have children?
Yes.
Absolutely. Because we all know the blunt truth of the thing is children will tear stuff up. That's just a reality, and so we know that landlords are, in particular, very sensitive to that. And so for a long time, families with children had a very hard time in the rental sector. And so they added this protection for them. But what the effect is, it's bigger than just rentals, it's sales too. And so we have to stay away from children as a topic. Is it okay to refer them to the school district's website? Yes, absolutely. Because that's a fact of the property itself. And like as Seth put in the chat, he would typically forward them like just the facts about the schools. This is Wake
Like
County
the
Schools.
ratings?
You know, here are the website for Wake County Schools. Here's the website for the particular elementary school, that sort of thing. Sarah, I think you asked about like ratings.
If they ask if that's a good school, you can just go base and show them the ratings. Sometimes you find them in the website.
You can do that, and a lot of agents do. Personally, I try to stay away from that, and I'll just tell you why. Because I used to do that, and then I had a really bad experience where a parent had a horrible experience at a school that was rated really highly on like good schools, and I had forwarded her the good schools information, and I felt really guilty because I felt like they had potentially made their choice based on that, at least partially. She never blamed me for it, but I just felt guilty for it. So I just decided from that day forward, I was only going to provide like factual information. I wasn't going to provide anything that was opinion based. So I'm not saying you'd be wrong to send them to like, those websites. I just felt like I didn't want to be responsible for somebody else's opinion. So.
That makes a lot of sense.
School ratings are not always very accurate either because it depends. It's based off of test scores a lot of times.
That's right.
So like you can have, for example, Title I schools typically have lower test scores than a non-Title I school.
Well, that's
but that
right.
doesn't mean that
you get to the idea of, well, the school rating site, they have their own criteria. So
yeah,
whether it's a good school as far as, the school rating site is concerned, it depends on what they weighted in their criteria. So that's why I give factual information, it's in, and I saw the question come up, are the school districts listed on MLS sheets? They are. They almost always are. What schools they feed into. And I will tell you, Wake County is the absolute most dangerous in that regard because Wake County, North Carolina, pretty much has across the board countywide school districts. That's not that much of a challenge in most counties where you might have, 10, 12 schools in the entire county. And so the districts, don't change that much, what schools they feed into. Any of you that are familiar with Wake County public schools know that in order to balance the student load from year to year, they continually move those lines. And so I find it very dangerous to tell somebody it's even in a particular school within Wake County. So what they allow us to do on MLS sheets in Wake County is just put Wake County School District. Because you could have a situation in Wake County where even if the property is located in a certain school's base district, if that school is already full and capped out, the student may end up going somewhere else just because there's no room left in that, that particular school. So I just, with schools, I try to give just the facts, the bare facts, and then invite them to do their own research. And I try to facilitate that research. If they say, well, is this a good elementary school in the area? I said, well, why don't I do this? I can call over and set up an appointment for you to meet with the principal. Man, that gets you right off the hook. They feel like you have done everything you possibly can. And I really didn't do anything. All I did was call and said, hey, will you meet with these people? And so that's a great one to use because then that allows them to make their own decision and it takes me out of it.
Did you see Brittany's question about the 55 and up communities? It's a little further up there.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the 55 and up communities in just a second, actually, because 55 and up communities would seem to discriminate against children, correct? As a matter of fact, they don't just seem to discriminate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
They do discriminate against children. 55 and up communities have covenants that say you can't have children here. So they are an exception to the rule. Don't you know? Whenever we talk about a rule, we always got to talk about the exceptions to the rule.
That's crazy to me.
Yeah, there are neighborhoods, those 55 and up communities, which are exceptions to this part of the Fair Housing Act, which allowed active discrimination against children.
So if you had a grandchild that lived with you, you wouldn't be able to live there?
That is correct. And as a matter of fact, there was one very notorious case recently, and I think it was in Ohio, where the child's parents were both killed in a car accident. The child is 13, parents were both killed in a car accident, and the grandparents live in a 55 and up community. And the child came to live with the grandparents after his parents were killed in a car accident, and the HOA is foreclosing on the grandparents because of violating the covenants against having children live in the neighborhood.
Why can't
That's
they just?
insane.
Wow.
That's crazy. Obviously, they don't care
There's
about the feelings.
strong HOA.
And it really super. I mean, my first reaction was like every one of your actions, like, oh my God, the HOA people are gonna burn in hell. Like, how horrible can you be? But when I read it, admittedly, it was a really interesting case because the HOA's attorney actually didn't even want to file the foreclosure, but it was pointed out to the attorney for the HOA that if they didn't enforce the covenant in this one instance, they probably wouldn't have the ability to enforce it down the road. They wouldn't be able, that somebody else who wasn't in this sort of a situation might just come in with their children and say, well, you didn't enforce it then, so you can't enforce it now. And so the HOA felt compelled to enforce this just to be able to keep it as a 55 and up. I mean, it was a really, really interesting case for
Wow.
That's so discriminatory. Like, I don't even know how that can be an exception.
It's federal law. There's a federal law that exempts those communities. And so that, they are allowed to exist as an exemption. Now they have to go through a process to be declared a 55 and up community. We're going to talk about what that process is. Yeah.
Stay away.
Justine said, there goes the neighborhood. We let a child.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because a child.
Exactly.
It's the best thing in a neighborhood.
We've got those neighborhoods around here. In fact, there's one over in Cary. There's several, but there's one in Cary that I sold in a lot when it first came here called the Carolina Preserve. It's over at Amber.
I sold one in there.
First of all, I always thought it was a horrible thing to name a neighborhood for old people. Don't call it the Preserve. That's a bad name for the neighborhood. Like, what exactly are you preserving them in? I don't know. I don't want to know.
Oh my God.
But they have like super strict covenants. Like, even if your grandchildren visit, and it doesn't say grandchildren in the covenants, it says anybody under the age of 18.
Right.
If you have somebody under the age of 18 visit, they can only visit for 48 hours and then they have to leave. So like the kids can't even stay more than 2 days. And the neighborhood has like all these super nice amenities. It has an indoor pool and tennis courts and all this stuff.
Looks like Wet and Wild.
Children can't use any of it. So it's so sad. You go out there and like you see this poor kid that's like visiting grandma and granddad for there's 2 days that they're allowed. And all the old people are inside swimming in the pool and the kids are like outside like peeking in the
Oh,
window.
that's horrible.
In there. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
But those are the exemption the exception neighborhood.
It's like a vacation there for old people though.
You
Yeah.
want to get away from your kids.
Yeah. All right. Are we good on these protected classes? What the 7 of them are. So your challenge on the test is going to be don't apply the protections to other things, because it sounds good to say, if Travis refuses to sell to a couple who's in their 70s, well, that's discrimination. It sounds good to say that, but if you look at this list, is that illegal discrimination?
No.
No, it's not, because age is not on here. Okay, so you got to be really careful about is the thing you're talking about actually on the list. Handicapping status is one of the other more common areas where we see discriminatory activity, particularly with landlords who do not wish for their property to be modified. I'm going to make this as clear as I can. The Federal Fair Housing Act says that if a tenant needs a reasonable modification to the property and they are willing to pay for it, then the landlord cannot refuse the modification. They must allow the modification to be made. If the tenant needs it and the tenant's willing to pay for it, then they must allow it. And this comes up as a big like bone of contention. What if the home, because this has come up in Raleigh, what if the home's in a historic district? What if that front porch railing is original to the house that was built in 1812, but to put a handicap ramp, we have to take those front porch railings down? Can the owner refuse to take it? And the house is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's in a historic preservation zone. It says you can't change anything about the house, but you've got a tenant in there and they need a wheelchair ramp. Can the landlord refuse the tenant putting in that wheelchair ramp? What do you think?
No.
They cannot. This law says that that landlord must allow that change. Must. They do not have a choice. No matter what other rules there might be, they got to follow this rule. I'll tell you another place where this is going to come up as a problem for landlords. Service animals. No. I thought I had a slide for them right there, but I don't. Service animals. Service animals are protected under the Fair Housing Act as an extension of people who have a handicap. Service animals are not pets. Pet rules do not apply to service animals. What if a landlord has a homeowner's insurance policy that says pit bulls are not allowed, that they won't cover the property that has pit bulls, or Siberian Huskies? That's another one that shows up commonly. And their tenant has a service Siberian Husky, and it says on the insurance, no Siberian Huskies. People ask why Huskies, because they're escape artists. They get out of everything. You can't keep them fenced in. You have a 27-foot high fence and a Husky will climb it and be gone. They're crazy. They're awesome, but they're crazy. But let's say you've got an insurance policy that says no Huskies. And so you put on your rentals, no Huskies allowed. And your tenant pops up with a Siberian Husky assistance animal. Do you allow the animal?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. No question about it. And you don't think twice, because you would be violating federal law not to allow the animal.
How do you get your dog made into a service animal?
Well, that is a very large bone of contention currently. We're undergoing sort of an evolution here about service animals in the residential setting. Current guidance is basically if the tenant says it's a service animal, it's a service animal. There is a big push to get some parameters about that, you know, some type of doctor certification process, but right now those don't exist. So right now, basically, if the tenant says it's a service animal, it's a service animal.
So you're not required to show paperwork?
Not right now. Not right now. Unless
You can't even ask them about if it is.
you can't ask them why they need it. You can't ask them you can't ask them what their disability is. You can't ask
Yeah,
them
because questioning it at all can end up being a lawsuit then.
right. It can be a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so that's the current guidance. There is a push to get to a place where service animals would be documented at least by a physician, but that we're not there yet. We're not there yet.
Is that North Carolina or federal?
That's federal. That's
So
federal.
if there was a condominium complex that said your dogs had to be under a certain weight, if they were a service animal, that's out of the...
That is correct. Now, when you use the word dogs plural, there is guidance on multiple service animals. If someone presents and says they have multiple service animals, then a landlord or a property manager could request documentation of the need for more than one service animal. That's not to say that they wouldn't have it, but that you could request the need for multiple service animals.
So could it be any service animal? It can be a goat, a pony,
Yeah.
anything?
Fair Housing Act does not specify.
Yeah.
That, cat,
Wow.
Oh my
Hey.
Lord.
yeah. The whole nine.
Pony, pigs,
Monkey.
Yeah, they had a pony on a plane. I saw her.
Yeah, I know.
It was her. It was her little service animal, and I'm like, Lord Jesus, that poor pony.
Yeah. Well, there's a lady in Chapel Hill who has a miniature horse as a service animal. He's the most awesome thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Well, here's why he's awesome. He wears shoes everywhere. She's blind. She's vision impaired. And he's a vision assistance animal. And he wears shoes everywhere so he doesn't slide, because horses have hooves. And so he gets on like slick floors and slides around. So he wears tennis shoes. Well, years ago, and she's been in Chapel Hill forever, and the horse has been with her forever. Years ago, when Michael Jordan had his steakhouse on Franklin Street, she used to eat dinner there every once in a while. And he was Michael was in the restaurant twice when she went in there, and he's completely enamored by the fact that the horse wears shoes. So the horse now has a never-ending lifetime supply of Jordans. That's what he wears.
Oh.
They send as many pairs of Jordans as she wants for the horse. And so sometimes he has on 4 that match, sometimes it's 2 and 2. He wears different Jordans every day.
That's very cool.
It's awesome. So yes, if you're driving around Chapel Hill and you see a van go by with a horse sitting in the front seat and a lady sitting down in the back, it isn't something. You really saw that. That's really what you saw. So, okay, but yes, it could be any animal.
And it could work for an apartment, you said?
I'm sorry?
It could work for an apartment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this would be any residential property. Any residential property. As we said, age is not protected as one of these protected classes. And so don't think familial status refers to age, because it does not. What are the exemptions or exceptions? I would imagine you might see some test questions from, they always like to ask you about the exceptions to rules, right? They ask you about the rule, but then they also ask you about the exceptions to the rule. There are some narrow exceptions to the Fair Housing Act. Of course, all commercial transactions are exempt because it's fair housing. It only applies to residential transactions in the first place. So commercial transactions are automatically, but there are other exemptions that come into play, and we need to talk about what those exemptions are. The first ones are those 55 and up communities that Sheila mentioned. 55 and up communities exist as an exception to the Fair Housing Act. Now, they're not exempt from the whole Fair Housing Act, just the familial status. So it's still illegal in a 55 and up community to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, gender, or handicapping status. Those 6 are still prevented. But familial status, or children, goes out the window when you are dealing with a 55 and up community. For a community to be declared a 55 and up community, they have to meet these requirements. And so you might see these requirements on a test. You would have to show that there are 0, none, no children under the age of 18 currently living in the neighborhood at the time you applied for this exemption. So just as a practical nature, this usually, when do you think we usually apply for this exemption? Before anybody owns in the neighborhood, right? The developer normally does this in the beginning. Could a neighborhood in theory convert to a 55 and up community? The answer is yes, but it'd be very hard to find a neighborhood where there were 0 children under the age of 18 living in the neighborhood if it was already an established neighborhood. So at the time you make the declaration that it's a 55 and up community, there have to be no children under the age of 18 living in the neighborhood, and at least 80% of the adults have to be above the age of 55. You don't have to have all of the adults above 55, but at least 80% of them have to be above 55. Now, you can read between the lines about what kind of relationships they're kind of making allowances for here. You know, those May, December, you know, people got to have the trophies, I guess, you know. So that's, but on 80, so you get the 20% allowance for the trophies, I'm guessing.
That's pretty funny. They can discriminate against your partner too.
That's true, right? So that at least 80% of the adults in the neighborhood have to be over the age of 55 at the time you declare, and it has to stay that way. Those are the requirements for being a 55 and up community. And that's the first exemption to the Fair Housing Act that we talk about.
I have a question.
Go for it.
I know I said earlier that if you mentioned the couple who they passed away and their kid ended up trying to go live with their grandparents, but it wouldn't happen.
Yep.
What if a single man was living in one of them facilities and married someone new and she had a kid? They couldn't live.
The child cannot live in the home.
Mm.
Child cannot live in the property. So they either have to have somewhere else for the child to reside, or they'd have to sell the property and move somewhere else.
I have a question back about the handicapping status. You said if the tenant is willing to pay for it, that's when the landlord has. So unless it's a public, because earlier we said if it's public, then they have to make modifications.
Great question. Public facilities are not the Fair Housing Act.
Okay, so they have to do it, and if it's housing, okay, thanks. That's what I was trying to know.
Public facilities are the Americans with Disabilities Act. Homes are the Fair Housing Act.
Okay.
The difference between the two is who pays. If it's a public facility, then the owner of the facility pays, the property owner. If it's a home, a residential unit, then the tenant pays.
Okay, so if it's an apartment complex, they need to have access to their office to handicap people, but not.
Right. In an apartment complex, the offices, the amenities, all those kinds of things, the landlord would have to provide access and would have to pay for that access. But once you get into the actual units, that would be up to the tenant to pay for any modification.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to take us all the way back. I just wanted to clarify.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Okay.
Just to clarify, Travis, Deborah had asked, can a 19-year-old with grandparents in a 55 and up community?
Can a 19-year-old live with their grandparents in a 55 and up community? I see no reason why not, as long as the 19-year-old did not cause the community to exceed that 20%. You couldn't have more than 20% of the residents be below the age of 55. So as long as they had some leeway there on that, then the 19-year-old should be able to stay there.
Okay.
Yeah. I think Ethan had a question as well.
I answered my own question. Thank you.
Okay. All right. This is the best kind. The best one. All right. So now let's talk about some other exceptions to the Fair Housing Act. Generally speaking, none of these exceptions apply if somebody with a real estate license is involved in the transaction. If someone hires a buyer, a seller, a landlord, a tenant, if anybody in the transaction hires a real estate agent to represent them, then these exceptions go out the window. These exemptions go away. That's another way of saying real estate licensees always have to follow the Fair Housing Act. Is everybody with me so far on that? So if a real estate agent is involved in any way, there is no exceptions to the Fair Housing Act. Okay? None.
I don't get that.
So like what I'm saying is, if you right now, you don't have your real estate license, correct, Sheila?
Right.
If you decided you wanted to sell your house for sale by owner today, you could discriminate. You are not required to follow the Fair Housing Act. Because if you look right here, it says the sale or rental of a single family home is exempt when, and what's the first thing it says here?
No broker is used.
No broker is used. So somebody who does not hire a real estate agent does not have to follow the Fair Housing Act. That's what we're saying here. But in the event that someone is operating without a real estate agent, they don't use a real estate agent at all. If they don't advertise in their discrimination, so they can discriminate, but they can't advertise they're going to discriminate. And if they don't own more than 3 of those kind of properties, if they meet all of these, this whole section right here, then they are exempt from the Fair Housing Act, meaning
That's
it is legal for them to discriminate. So I'm just going to give you a vivid example of what I mean by that. Let's say that you have a seller who has their property on the market for sale by owner. That's the only sign they have out, for sale by owner. That's the only advertising they've done. They're not advertising any other way, for sale by owner. And a buyer drives through the neighborhood and goes up to the front door and knocks on the front door and says, hey, I'm interested in selling you the property. And the owner goes, you're not from here, are you? And the buyer goes, well, no, I moved here from Mexico. Oh, I don't sell to Mexicans. That would be legal because it did not involve a real estate agent and because the discrimination was not advertised.
So touching base on that, Christina asked, so that is like when you see an advertisement wants to rent to females only. That would not be allowed.
And there is a great point. Christina, someone can choose not to rent to females, but they cannot advertise that they will not rent to females. You only are exempt from the Fair Housing Act if all of these 3 things is true. If you are not using a real estate agent, if you are not advertising your discrimination, and if you don't own more than 3 of those kinds of properties. If all 3 things are true, then you're exempt from the Fair Housing Act. Now, I personally think it's crazy they're exempt, but that's what the law says.
Okay, Travis, I do
Yes,
have
sir.
a question now. So I've seen on Facebook, like people will go on Facebook, like advertising a room for rent or whatever. Don't take this the wrong way, but most of the time it's females. They'll put like seeking a female roommate only.
Yep.
Is that legal or not legal?
That is not legal. It is advertising that you intend to discriminate.
Ethan,
Now-
that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I know. He's asking about the same exact thing you're asking about. And so it is legal for them not to rent to males. It is legal for them to say to themselves, I'm not going to rent to any males. And it would be legal for them to even tell any males who inquire to say, I'm sorry, I'm just not comfortable renting to males, you know? But it's not legal for them to advertise to the world that I'm going to discriminate against males, that I'm only going to rent to females.
So
So
pretty
you can't
much
put
you
that
would
behind
have,
a plane and go down the beach, but go ahead.
I'm sorry, Seth. So pretty much you would just have to do it behind, like, so say they come up to you and you're like, okay, well, I'm actually not interested in a guy.
Yes, that's
Right.
exactly right. You would have to do it case by case, right? Now, keep in mind, what's the first bullet point there? It also only applies if they don't use a real estate agent. So any owner who hires a property manager, you can forget these exemptions. Any owner that hires a property manager is going to have to follow the Fair Housing Act. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep.
Yeah.
Because they've involved a real estate agent.
Travis, okay, you just said though that if a woman advertises that she only wants a woman for a roommate in her house, but if she's advertising, that's illegal. Is that what you just said?
That's what I said.
But she's not a realtor.
Correct.
She's
but
not a broker.
She cannot advertise that she intends to discriminate. She can discriminate. She can choose not to rent to males. but she
You
is
just
not
can't
considered-
advertise it.
Can't advertise it. It's the advertising part.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
The part that I'm confused on, and this is probably like the most common sense thing, my brain is making it way more than what it is. When it says the owner owns no more than 3 such properties.
Right.
I'm not comprehending like what.
So here's what that's there to prevent. Somebody who owns 100 rental properties and manages all their own properties from discriminating who they rent to.
Okay.
Basically, this exemption is only for like people who are renting out their own house or renting out. It's meant to not be for big investors that own a bunch of properties.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make that clear because my brain was just like, what?
Yeah. So if you own more than 3 properties and you're renting them out, you can't discriminate even if you don't hire a real estate broker, and even if you don't advertise the discrimination, you can't do it.
Or would a developer that owns a subdivision
A
cannot
developer could not do that. A developer could not discriminate because they own more than 3 such properties. Exactly right.
So, and you could discriminate if you're an apartment instead of a single family home.
Apartments are not exempt ever.
Okay. Okay.
These exemptions only apply to single family homes. Yeah.
Oh.
So Travis, you couldn't put in an ad for your own house that you're looking for a roommate, but no, you don't want pets. But then if they say, well, I have a service dog, are you screwed or what? Or does that matter if you refuse to rent to them because you don't want pets? Hello?
You froze.
Do you hear?
He got quiet. At first I
Uh-oh.
thought it was me. I'm like, not my computer again.
I'm like,
I thought my computer went out.
Me too. Mine goes in and out all day.
Well,
Well,
Seth, you can tell us about
I'll be
Travis'
teaching the
house.
class.
Oh, shit.
All right.
Just kidding. I see him coming in on his other computer.
Yeah. Can you hear?
We
You
can
better
hear.
Stop talking about him.
Yeah, you better. I'm not sure what happened there. Y'all blew up my machine, so we'll have to.
Seth was just done telling us all the details about your house.
Hey,
Got back.
I shared all the pictures.
We love it.
see, now y'all see why I have 2 machines going at all times, because you just
We
never.
Oh,
did.
that is a good idea.
There we go. So I'll work off of this one for now then. As long as everybody can hear me, okay? Are we good?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Different perspective.
Yeah, it's a very different perspective. Exactly. I never had. I'll never. No, of course you are.
Is it working now?
Very Star Wars now.
Hold on, I have to mute you. There we go.
Nope. There we go.
No, you're still muted.
This was kind of like one of my other Zoom meetings the other day. My audio just went completely out. Or my microphone did. It was weird.
I just froze
Now
up
can
again.
you hear me? Now,
Yes.
There we go.
You're in 2 places.
I know. Now I'm in 2 places. I'm gonna stop that one. Stop that one. All right. So sorry about that. I have no idea what happened, but Zoom restarted on my main computer for some reason. Who knows? But I think before I lost you all, I was being asked about if I advertise for my property and I say I don't want to accept pets, and then somebody shows up with a service animal, am I obligated to accept the service animal? Is that right, Barbara? I think that's what you were asking me before.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And the answer would be yes. I would be obligated to accept the service animal unless I met one of these exemptions. If I was an individual property owner and I was renting out my own house and I wasn't using a real estate agent and I wasn't advertising that I was going to discriminate, then I could say, no, I'm not allowing your service animal either, because I'm exempt from the Fair Housing Act. So, okay, are we good on the exemption so far? Tanya, you got a question?
Yeah. Okay. So you know how earlier you said that you can only advertise if you have a BIC?
Yes.
Okay. So that means they can't advertise anything in general, right?
We're not talking about real estate agents. Great question. These are people who are not real estate agents. We are talking about the general public.
So can they still, like, if someone is selling for sale by owner, they can still advertise their property? Oh, yeah.
Yes, someone selling for sale by owner can absolutely advertise. What we're saying when we say you can't advertise unless you have a BIC, we're saying you can't advertise as a real estate agent unless you have a BIC. Certainly someone who, I love how Danya starts every question, by the way, with you. So you know how you said earlier, like I know what I said earlier. I don't know what I said earlier.
I remember, so that counts, kind of.
All right. Are we good so far on this exemption? Because it's something you got to get your brain wrapped around. So here's who we're talking about. We're talking about property owners who don't have a real estate license. They don't want to hire a real estate agent. And they are not advertising in any way that they're going to discriminate, but they still might discriminate. They are exempt. Okay, they're exempt from the Federal Fair Housing Act and all of the Federal Fair Housing Act. The other people who are always exempt, okay, if you are living in a rental unit. This is the second exemption down here, so I'm going to erase this stuff out of the way. If you are not living in a rental unit, if you are living in a property that you own, and you are renting out a portion of that property. So like if you have a duplex or a triplex, quadruplex, and you live in one of the units personally, then you are exempt from the Federal Fair Housing Act for renting out. Basically, this allows you to choose your roommates. So if you are exempt, if you are living in a property and you're renting out a portion of that property, then you're exempt from the Federal Fair Housing Act. Again, as long as no real estate broker is used.
Or advertising.
Or discriminatory advertising.
Travis, what if you are the owner of the property and you hold a real estate license?
Then you're still not exempt. That's a great question. Any real estate licensee at all being involved would cancel these exemptions.
I have a question. My cousin, she got married, and when she got married, her husband had already been living in a duplex in Greenville, but his mother was the other occupant. She, her family actually owned the management company that had a whole bunch of houses in Greenville, but she initially just chose them to live next door because she needed their help and stuff. So that would, she wouldn't have to follow it.
Give me the whole scenario again. I want to make sure I didn't miss it.
So my cousin, she married this man, and he was already living in a duplex in Greenville. And his mother was already living on the other side of the duplex, and her family owns the management company that has this property. So would she still not have to follow the Fair Housing Act?
Not for anybody that's going to live in that same duplex, but she would have to follow it for any other units, any other properties. But this exemption would only be for renting out a portion of the home you're living in.
Okay.
All right. Those are the exemptions that you might be tested on. Also, any property that's owned by a religious organization is automatically exempt. If it's owned by a church or synagogue or a temple or what may have you, the property that's owned by any religious organization would be exempt from the Fair Housing Act. You don't need to worry about the North Carolina Fair Housing Act. They are not testing this in the North Carolina section anymore. You don't need to worry about the differences between the North Carolina Act and the Federal Act. Just make sure you're good on the Federal Act, and you will be okay. All you need to know about the North Carolina Fair Housing Act in particular is that our protected classes are exactly the same as the federal protected classes. There's no difference. We use the same 7 that the federal government uses. That's about it. I'm sorry, Seth?
Fresh corn.
Fresh corn, exactly right. Who enforces the Fair Housing Act? Well, HUD does on the federal level. On the North Carolina level, it's the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. That's who would handle those complaints. And some vocabulary. So this is where I would definitely make sure you know this vocabulary right here. The next 3 vocabulary words we're going to talk about, make sure you know these because they're going to be important. All right. Steering. Steering is a violation of federal fair housing laws when the real estate agent in question is dealing with a buyer. You steer a buyer. So if a buyer says, you know, well, is this a good neighborhood? And you say, well, for families like yours, you'd probably be more comfortable across town. You are steering the buyer away from a neighborhood or steering a buyer toward a neighborhood. Any fair housing violation that happens with a buyer is called steering. Everybody with me so far? I don't care what the violation is, whether it's based on race or religion or handicapping status. If the person you're dealing with is a buyer, then you are guilty of steering. If you violate the Federal Fair Housing Act and you're dealing with a buyer, that's called steering. If you violate the Federal Fair Housing Act with a seller, the thing you did or said that was wrong happened with a seller, that is called blockbusting. Blockbusting is a violation with a seller. Steering is a violation with a buyer. So let's say Susan goes and knocks on doors in a neighborhood, and when the homeowner comes out, she says, hey, my name is Susan, and I just thought I'd stop by today to see if you had any interest in selling your house. And first of all, can Susan do that? Is that legal? Door to door, not ask you if that is?
Yeah.
Yes. That's not one of those regulated forms of communication. She can knock on doors. She might not be able to call them, but she can knock on the door. So she knocks on the door. She says, I'm just wondering if you're interested in selling your house. And the seller says, no, we're really happy here. We're not going to go anywhere. And Susan goes, well, you might want to think about that, because I don't know if you just saw who moved in across the street, but when those folks move in, property value is just not too good. That's a fair housing violation, potentially. Who is she talking to? Is she talking to a buyer or a seller?
Seller.
She's talking to a seller. So is this blockbusting or is this steering?
Blockbusting.
This is blockbusting. That's blockbusting. Seth takes a family to a particular neighborhood because he knows that there are lots of families who immigrated from Nicaragua who live in that neighborhood. Is that an example of steering or blockbusting?
Steering.
That's steering because he's dealing with buyers. Okay, so if it's a violation on the buyer side, it's called steering. A violation on the seller side is called blockbusting. We talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act, so I don't need to go into that anymore. There is one other law that deals with discrimination that we do need to talk about, which is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Credit, not housing, credit. This only applies when somebody is applying for what?
A loan.
A loan, credit. This is about loans. This law deals with equal access to lending. And it's very similar to the Fair Housing Act because it says you can't discriminate on the basis of 7 things. It would be real nice if they were the same 7 things. Guess what? They're not.
They have age.
It's different.
and
Now,
they have-
race, color, religion, national origin, and sex are all the same. But down here at the bottom, they're different. We don't have familial status, we have marital status. So it is illegal to give or not give a loan to someone based on their marital status. Down there at the bottom, it says age is a protected class under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So let me ask you a question. Would it be a violation for Deborah to refuse to rent a property to a couple in their 80s because of their age? Would that be a violation, or would she be within her legal rights to do so as a real estate agent? Would that be a violation if Deborah refused to rent a property to a couple who were in their 80s?
No.
That is not a violation, because the Fair Housing Act does not have what as a protected class? Age. But it would be a violation if Deborah was a mortgage lender to say, I'm not giving you a 30-year mortgage, you're in your 80s, you're going to be dead by the time you have to pay this thing back. That would be a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So be real careful with age, because it is protected in one but not in the other. Okay? And then this is a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Somebody asked the question earlier, what was redlining? Redlining is a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So anytime a lender has violated the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, we call that redlining. And the name comes from, you know, there was a time when lenders would basically discriminate by going up to a map and saying, we're not making any loans here. And they would just draw a red circle on the map and say, you know, the kind of people that live here, we don't want to make loans to. But now we use the term to refer to any violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So a fair housing violation that deals with buyers is called what?
Steering.
Steering. A fair housing violation that deals with sellers is called what?
Blockbusting.
Blockbusting.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Sure.
So when you see a listing that says family-oriented neighborhood, is that steering?
No,
Or
because
blockbusting?
family is not a protected class. There's nothing in that advertisement that mentions anything that is a protected class. Remember, the protected class is children.
Gotcha.
So if the ad said a great neighborhood for children, that would be steering, because you would be advertising to buyers saying this is a great neighborhood for children. That would be an example of steering.
Okay.
Question.
Thank you.
Sheila asked if handicapping status is if lenders can discriminate towards them. And I have a question. Can they discriminate towards them also, like if they don't accept any disability checks or anything as income?
So type of income is something that is protected. Where their income, basically lenders are required by law to treat all income the same. They can't discriminate based on where somebody, they can't say, oh, well, your income's from child support, so that doesn't count. They can't, you know, they can't say, oh, your income's from a disability check, so that doesn't count. Basically, they're required to treat income as income. As with regard to the question of can you discriminate on the basis of handicap for credit, unfortunately, the answer is yes. It's not a protected class for the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So these are the kinds of things your Congress people need to get busy fixing.
Good point.
Only other thing I'll say about this is if you become a realtor, there is such a thing as the Realtor Code of Ethics, and the Realtor Code of Ethics is much stricter than the Federal Fair Housing Act. as far as what a realtor will and will not do, and who they will protect and who they won't protect. You're not going to be tested on this, but just make sure you understand that if you do end up joining the Association of Realtors, there will be some additional things that you will have to agree to abide by as a realtor that you would not as a licensee who is not a realtor. Basically,
That
realtor.
hopefully deals more like, but do they go against the Federal Discriminatory Act?
No,
Or they're just,
you're free to be more strict. You can't be less strict than the federal act.
Okay.
You're free to be more strict. And so basically what the Association of Realtors has done is they said, well, you know, we think that's a good start, but it's not enough. So we've added our own protected classes and said, if you're a realtor, you will not discriminate on the basis of, you know, race, color, religion, national origin, familial status, handicapping status, gender, or sexual orientation, gender identity, are the ones that the realtors have added to their protected classes.
got it, but they can't change the exceptions
They can't
and
change
fix those wrongs.
because the exceptions don't apply to realtors anyway. You know, because anytime
Yeah.
a real estate agent is involved, the exceptions go away.
Got it.
All right. That is it. Look at that. 3 chapters today. Look how good y'all are. Yeah, I told